Fans of 90s television surely can't forget Hakeem, the witty best friend who always brought refreshing laughter to the sitcom Moesha. Lamont Bentley, who breathed life into that role, was once expected to become a new generation superstar, but that laughter was brutally extinguished on a Southern California highway. In 2005, when his career was plummeting due to Hollywood turning its back on him and typecasting him in certain roles, Lamont lost his life in a multi-rollover car accident. He was thrown from the vehicle and died instantly, leaving behind two young daughters. How could a young talent who once brought joy to millions of American families end his life in such despair and a bloody tragedy? To understand the death of Lamont Bentley, we must completely dismantle the fairy tale of Hollywood. Hollywood has always been a master of illusion. It sells the American dream with unparalleled efficiency. It tells us that talent, hard work, and a good heart are the keys to the kingdom. But behind the velvet curtains, the industry operates as a ruthless, highly calibrated assembly jet. It is a machine that requires raw material to function. In the 1990s, the networks discovered that urban black-led sitcoms were incredibly lucrative. They were a gold mine. The networks needed young, charismatic faces to capture the demographic, to sell advertising space, and to build their empires. They invited these young actors in. They handed them scripts. They put them in front of the cameras. On paper, it looked like progress. It looked like equality. We saw diverse casts. We saw black families in prime time, and we applauded the industry for its apparent open-mindedness. But the machine has no memory. It has no loyalty, and it certainly has no soul. The tragedy of Lamont Bentley did not begin on the 118 freeway in 2005. The seeds of his destruction were sown the very moment he signed his first major contract. They were planted in the very scripts he was handed, in the specific type of laughter he was instructed to elicit from the audience. He was being set up to fall. This is the hidden mechanism of Hollywood's cruelty. It does not murder its young stars with a knife in the dark. It murders them with apathy. It murders them by placing them on a pedestal so high that the air becomes thin. And then, the moment they stop being perfectly profitable, in the exact narrow way the studio demands, it simply kicks the pedestal out from underneath them. The narrative we have been sold about child stars and young television actors who fade away is that they somehow failed. We are told they couldn't handle the pressure, that they lacked the discipline for an adult career. But when we examine the actual architecture of the industry, a much more sinister reality emerges. They did not fail the system. The system was meticulously designed to extract their youth, exploit their cultural cachet, and then discard them before they could accumulate enough power to demand true artistic and financial equality. Lamont Bentley was a brilliant, vibrant soul who thought he was entering a collaborative artistic community. He did not realize he was stepping onto a conveyor belt that led directly to an incinerator. The laughter we hear when we play back those old tapes is undeniably real. His talent was real. But the promise of a safe, respected future, that was the most elaborate fiction Hollywood ever produced. As we pull back the layers of this story, we must keep the image of the shattered freeway in our minds. That wreckage is the ultimate metaphor for what happens when a human being is treated as a disposable punchline. To understand how he ended up in the dark, fighting a solitary war for his own survival, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to look at the boy before he became the product. And we have to examine the specific insidious trap that was laid out for him the moment the cameras first started rolling. The trap that was disguised as the opportunity of a lifetime. To understand how a trap is sprung, you must first examine the bait, and to understand the bait, you must look closely at the hunger of the prey. Artemis Lamont Bentley was not born into Hollywood royalty. He was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1973, a city far removed from the palm trees and the neon glow of the Sunset Strip. He relocated to Los Angeles with his family, carrying the kind of quiet, desperate ambition that is familiar to anyone who has ever looked at their circumstances and decided that they must, at all costs, rewrite their own destiny. He was a young black boy navigating the complexities of America in the 1980s and early 90s, an era where the streets of Los Angeles were fraught with systemic challenges and the avenues for escape were notoriously narrow. For a young man with a magnetic personality and an instinct for performance, the entertainment industry looked like a golden ladder dropped down from the heavens. It was the ultimate promise. It whispered that if you were talented enough, funny enough, and worked hard enough, you could transcend your zip code. You could save your family. You could become immortal. This is the psychological vulnerability that the studio system relies upon. They do not hunt for the satisfied. They hunt for the hungry. When we look back at the mid-1990s, the television landscape was undergoing a tectonic shift. For decades, the major networks ABC, CBS, and NBC had operated as an exclusive oligopoly, dictating the cultural narrative with a predominantly white, sanitized vision of American life. But as the decade progressed, a rebellion occurred in the boardroom. Upstart networks, most notably Fox, the WB, and UPN, entered the arena. They were desperate for market share, and they quickly realized a fundamental, highly lucrative truth. There was a massive, untapped, and fiercely loyal demographic of black viewers who were starving to see themselves represented on screen. This was not a civil rights movement engineered by studio executives. Let us be absolutely clear. This was a gold rush. It was a calculated corporate extraction of cultural capital. The executives needed authentic faces to legitimize their new networks. They needed young, vibrant black talent to act as the vanguard for their advertising revenue. And so the doors of Hollywood, which had been bolted shut for so long, were suddenly seductively thrown open. Enter Lamont Bentley. When the casting call went out for a new sitcom starring the teenage R&B sensation Brandy Norwood, a show that would eventually be titled Moesha, the producers were looking for a specific archetype. They needed the quintessential best friend. They needed the comic relief. They needed a character who could burst into a room, deliver a punchline, steal a slice of pizza, and leave the audience roaring. Lamont walked into that audition room and did not just read the lines. He breathed life into a cultural touchstone. He was Hakeem Campbell. The chemistry was instantaneous. He possessed an innate kinetic comedic timing that cannot be taught in acting classes. It is a visceral rhythm, born from the necessity of using humor to navigate the world. The producers saw it immediately. They did not just see a talented actor. They saw a cornerstone for their franchise. They saw millions of dollars in syndication rights. They saw their network's anchor. And so the gilded cage was constructed. To the outside world, and likely to a young Lamont himself, the day he signed his network contract was the greatest day of his life. It was the realization of the American dream. He had made it. He was going to be on television. But if we function as investigators of this history, we must read the fine print of that era. We must look at the brutal mathematics of 1990s television contracts, particularly for young actors of color who lacked the institutional power and aggressive legal representation afforded to their white counterparts. When a young actor signs on to a network television show, they are not entering a partnership. They are signing a document of indentured servitude wrapped in the illusion of glamour. Standard industry contracts of that era locked actors in for up to 7 years. The studios held all the options. If the show failed, the actor was discarded without a second thought. But if the show succeeded, if it became a global phenomenon, as Moesha did, the studio reaped astronomical exponential profits while the actor's salary remained rigidly tethered to the pre-negotiated terms of their initial desperate signing. Historical data and industry analyses from this period reveal a stark, uncomfortable disparity. While the casts of predominantly white sitcoms on major networks were famously negotiating collectively for millions of dollars per episode, the stars of black-led sitcoms on fledgling networks were often fighting for comparative scraps. They were the foundational pillars keeping entire television networks afloat, yet their compensation, residual structures, and merchandising rights were heavily suppressed. The studio executives effectively purchased Lamont Bentley's youth at a massive discount. They bought his face, his voice, his comedic rhythm, and his physical energy, and they codified their ownership in legally binding ink. Do not mistake this for a mere financial grievance. The financial disparity is simply the mechanism of control. The true violence of the gilded cage is psychological. Imagine the reality of Lamont's daily life once the cameras started rolling. The schedule of a network sitcom is a relentless, grinding industrial machine. It demands 14, sometimes 16-hour days. It requires actors to hit their marks perfectly, to repeat the same lines from multiple angles, to manufacture high-energy joy on command, take after take, week after week, month after month. For a teenager transitioning into his early 20s, this environment is a vacuum. The studio lot becomes the entire universe. The outside world fades away. The executives, the directors, and the producers step into the roles of surrogate parents and guardians. They pat the young actors on the back. They order catered lunches. They use the word family relentlessly. "We are a family here," they say. "We are making history together." This is the most insidious psychological manipulation of all. By framing a multi-million-dollar corporate factory as a family, the system effectively neutralizes any impulse the young actor might have to demand better treatment, fairer pay, or creative growth. You do not negotiate aggressively with your family. You do not demand a larger share of the profits from your family. You simply do as you are told, you hit your marks, and you remain grateful that they let you sit at the table. Lamont was inherently grateful. He was a young man who wanted to provide for his real family. He wanted to be a professional, and he delivered. Episode after episode, season after season, he brought a level of effervescent energy to Moesha that helped propel the show to the top of the ratings charts. He became a fixture in the homes of millions. He was stopped in the streets. He was adored. But as the years passed, the walls of the gilded cage began to close in. The tragedy of early explosive success is that it freezes you in time in the eyes of the public, and more dangerously, in the eyes of your employers. When Lamont Bentley walked onto that set at the age of 22, 23, 24, he was physically maturing. He was experiencing the complexities of manhood. He was reading. He was studying his craft. He was observing the world, and his internal artistic reservoir was deepening. He was becoming a father. He was experiencing the profound gravity of adult life. Yet, when the director yelled, "Action!" He was legally and contractually obligated to instantly regress. He had to become the hungry teenager again. He had to widen his eyes, deliver the slapstick punchline, and play the fool. This is where the psychological fracturing begins. The human mind is not designed to sustain such a violent contradiction. The gap between who Lamont Bentley was becoming in the quiet moments of his real life and the static, two-dimensional caricature he was forced to inhabit for the cameras was widening into a chasm. He was earning a living, yes, but he was paying for it with his artistic soul. Historical context is vital here. In the days of the old Hollywood studio system, actors like Clark Gable or Judy Garland were bound by similarly draconian contracts. But the studios, out of a selfish need to protect their investments, usually provided a vast, albeit controlling, infrastructure of public relations, image management, and career transition planning. They engineered the growth of their stars. But the television landscape of the 1990s, particularly for black actors on networks like UPN, offered no such safety net. It was a smash-and-grab operation. The executives had no long-term vested interest in Lamont Bentley's evolution as a dramatic actor. They did not care about his desire to play complex, flawed, serious men. They had a formula that worked, a formula that kept the advertisers paying premium rates, and they were going to enforce that formula until the wheels fell off. Lamont was smart enough to see the trap. He understood that the longer he stayed perfectly inside the lines of Hakeem Campbell, the harder it would be to ever convince the industry that he could be anything else. He was looking at a horizon where his current success was actively sabotaging his future potential. He began to look for the exits. He began to desperately signal to the industry that there was a formidable, dramatic actor trapped inside the sitcom star's body. He sought out roles that would break the mold. He stepped onto the set of the horror anthology Tales from the Hood, delivering a performance as Crazy K that was shockingly dark, intense, and dripping with a raw, terrifying authenticity that completely obliterated the image of the lovable sitcom neighbor. It was a revelation. It was a desperate plea to the gatekeepers of Hollywood. Look at me. Look at what I can do. Do not lock me in this box. But the system is fundamentally resistant to change. The executives sitting in the glass towers of Burbank and Century City do not like it when their products decide to rewrite their own programming. When a young black man who has been highly profitable as a non-threatening source of comedic relief suddenly demands to be taken seriously, demands to be seen as powerful, complex, and dangerous, the system instinctively pushes back. They looked at his dramatic turns, they acknowledged the raw talent, and then they looked at their spreadsheets. Hakeem Campbell was a guaranteed return on investment. A leading dramatic Lamont Bentley was a risk. And in the boardrooms of Hollywood, risk is the ultimate sin. The message sent back down the corporate ladder was chillingly clear. Stay in your lane. Put the oversized clothes back on. Deliver the punchlines. Keep the audience comfortable. He had successfully escaped the struggles of his youth. He had climbed the golden ladder. He had secured the fame and the recognition he had dreamed of in Milwaukee. But as he stood at the summit, looking out over the sprawling empire of the entertainment industry, the devastating realization began to set in. He was not a king, he was a court jester. And the doors of the throne room were locked from the inside. He was trapped by his own brilliance. He was a victim of his own impeccable timing. He had played the game perfectly, exactly as he was instructed, only to discover that the rules were rigged to ensure he could never actually win. The gilded cage was secure, and the oxygen inside was slowly deliberately beginning to run out. And then, just as he was fighting to find a way to breathe, the network decided to turn off the lights entirely. To truly understand the machinery that eventually crushed Lamont Bentley, we must place the television industry of the 1990s on the autopsy table and examine its oldest, most diseased organ. We must dissect a cultural phenomenon so deeply embedded in Western entertainment that it operates almost entirely undetected by the casual viewer. We must talk about the curse of the comic relief, and more specifically, the insidious, suffocating archetype of the black best friend. If you study the architecture of a standard American sitcom, you will notice a strict hierarchy. There is the protagonist, who is permitted to be flawed, romantic, troubled, and ultimately triumphant. They are the emotional center of the universe. And orbiting this sun are the satellites, the supporting cast. In the racial dynamics of Hollywood, particularly during the era in which Lamont was rising to fame, the role assigned to the young, charismatic black male was almost exclusively that of the jester. This is not a modern invention. Cinematic historians trace the DNA of this specific archetype directly back to the minstrel shows of the 19th century. In that dark era of entertainment, white audiences demanded to be entertained by black performers, but they absolutely refused to acknowledge black humanity. They wanted the rhythm, the physical comedy, and the infectious laughter, but they violently rejected any display of intellect, romantic viability, or psychological depth. They wanted the performer to be utterly unthreatening. Fast forward a century. The burnt cork and the overt racial slurs had been swept away by the civil rights movement and changing social mores. The industry declared itself progressive, but the underlying psychological framework of the minstrel show had not been eradicated. It had simply been sanitized, repackaged, and broadcast in high definition. The modern studio system still craved the entertainment value, but they remained deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a young black man occupying a space of true, unadulterated power or complex vulnerability on screen. So they created a modernized Cage, the goofy neighbor, the hungry sidekick, the loyal friend who exists solely to dispense wisdom wrapped in slang, deliver a punchline, and then conveniently exit the scene before the real emotional heavy lifting begins. They are the architectural columns of a sitcom. They hold up the roof. They bear the weight of the pacing, but they are never actually allowed to live inside the house. This was the trap laid for Lamont Bentley, and the great agonizing irony of his life, his fatal flaw, his hamartia, was that he was simply too brilliant at playing the game. His comedic timing was a lethal weapon. He possessed a physical elasticity, a way of widening his eyes and delivering a line that bypassed the brain and went straight to the audience's funny bone. He made it look effortless. He made it look like it was not acting at all. And Hollywood, in its ruthless efficiency, took his brilliance and used it to forge his chains. When you are that good at making people laugh, the gatekeepers of the industry stop looking at you as an artist capable of transformation. They look at you as a perfectly calibrated machine that produces a highly specific, highly profitable product. They do not want the machine to evolve. They want it to keep producing the exact same widget over and over again until the public is utterly sick of it. Consider the day-to-day reality of this existence. Lamont was a man. He was navigating the treacherous waters of his 20s in Los Angeles. He was reading scripts, studying film, and feeling the profound, terrifying weight of fatherhood settling onto his shoulders. He was developing a rich, complex internal life filled with the anxieties, ambitions, and darker emotional currents that define adult masculinity. Yet, when he drove onto the studio lot, parked his car, and walked onto the soundstage, he was required to check his manhood at the door. The director would hand him a script where his entire function was to walk into a kitchen, look hungrily at a refrigerator, make a sarcastic comment about the protagonist's love life, and wait for the canned laughter to roll. Imagine the psychological dissonance. Imagine being a virtuoso violinist, capable of playing the most heartbreaking, complex symphonies, but you are contractually obligated under threat of financial ruin to stand on a stage and play a plastic kazoo for 8 hours a day. And worse, imagine thousands of people cheering for the kazoo, oblivious to the masterpiece you are begging to perform. This is not merely frustrating. It is a form of spiritual erosion. It hollows an artist out from the inside. Lamont did not suffer this silently. The narrative often paints victims of typecasting as passive recipients of their fate. But the historical record shows that Lamont fought a desperate, calculated war to break out of his prescribed box. He knew that the Hakeem persona was a ticking clock. He knew that if he did not prove his dramatic worth before the sitcom ended, he would be permanently branded. He actively sought out the shadows. In 1995, right as his comedic star was rising, he took a role in the critically acclaimed, racially charged horror anthology tales From the Hood. He played a character named Crazy K, a violent, nihilistic gang member, but Lamont did not play him as a standard, two-dimensional television thug. He injected the character with a terrifying, hollowed-out existential dread. His eyes, usually so bright and inviting on television, went dead. He moved with a coiled, unpredictable menace. It was a masterclass in dramatic tension. It was a shocking departure from his sitcom persona, a performance that should have been a screaming siren to every casting director in Hollywood that a major dramatic talent had arrived. Years later, in 2001, he took on the monumental task of portraying the legendary rapper Tupac Shakur in the television biopic Too Legit, the MC Hammer story. Playing Tupac is one of the most dangerous assignments an actor can undertake. Tupac is the ultimate symbol of complex, tragic, intellectual black masculinity. To get it wrong is to invite universal ridicule. But Lamont captured the kinetic energy, the paranoia, and the poetic chaos of Shakur with a startling, uncanny precision. Let us examine the evidence. Here was a young actor who was simultaneously anchoring a top-rated comedy series, delivering chilling performances in independent horror, and successfully embodying one of the most complex cultural icons of the decade. In a fair system, in a system based purely on merit, this trifecta would be the undeniable launch pad for a blockbuster movie career. A white actor demonstrating such incredible range in his 20s would immediately be swept up by elite talent agencies, handed prestige dramatic scripts, and groomed for Academy Awards. But Hollywood operates on a double standard that is as thick as bank vault steel. When the white child star or the white sitcom goofball decides to do a gritty indie drama, the industry applauds their bravery and rebrands them as a serious artist. When a black sitcom actor attempts the exact same maneuver, the industry views it as a glitch in the matrix. They pat him on the head, ignore the performance, and hand him another script where he plays the funny sidekick. The industry did not want a powerful, serious, leading black man in Lamont Bentley. A leading man commands respect. A leading man demands narrative control. A leading man eventually demands a percentage of the gross profits. A comic relief just takes a pre-negotiated check and stays out of the way. The executives looked at his breathtaking performance as Crazy K. They looked at his eerie embodiment of Tupac. And then they looked back at their syndication numbers for Moesha. The directive was clear. Do not encourage him. Keep him in the oversized clothes. Keep him hungry. Keep him funny. This is how the system enforces its will. It is rarely done through explicit prejudice in a boardroom. It is done through the quiet, suffocating violence of the casting process. It is the phone that does not ring. It is the agent who tells you they loved your dramatic read, Lamont, but they decided to go a different way. Hey, good news though, they want you to come in and read for the wacky postman in this new comedy pilot. Over time, this relentless rejection of your true self breaks down your psychological immune system. Lamont was trapped by a specific kind of fear, the fear of the provider. If he had been a single man with no responsibilities, perhaps he could have walked away. He could have burned his bridges, retreated to the theater, and refused to play the clown ever again. But he had Alethea. He had Artesia. He had daughters who needed to eat, who needed shelter, who needed a future. The studios are intimately aware of this leverage. They know that when an actor becomes a parent, their tolerance for risk plummets. The golden handcuffs tighten. You cannot stage an artistic rebellion when you have a mortgage to pay. You swallow your pride. You bury your artistic ambitions deep in your chest. You walk out onto the brightly lit soundstage, and you give the director exactly the goofy smile they are paying for. You become a hostage to your own success. Every time the studio audience laughed at Hakeem, they were unknowingly hammering another nail into the coffin of Lamont Bentley's dramatic career. He was drowning in plain sight, standing in front of millions of people, and no one could hear him screaming because his mouth was fixed in a permanent, contractually obligated grin. He was surviving, but he was not living. He was engaged in a daily act of self-mutilation, cutting away the deepest, most profound parts of his talent just to fit into the narrow, oxygen-starved box the industry had built for him. But as painful as the gilded cage is, it still provides shelter. It still provides a paycheck. The actor eventually learns to navigate the bars, to find small moments of joy in the work, and to convince himself that perhaps one day, if he is just patient enough and loyal enough, the gatekeepers will finally let him out. But what happens when the network executives, sitting in a boardroom miles away, decide that the sitcom is no longer highly profitable? What happens when they look at the shifting demographics, look at the rising salaries of the older cast, and decide it is time to clean house? What happens when the very cage that has suffocated you, defined you, and provided for your family is suddenly, violently dismantled, leaving you standing entirely alone in the wreckage? The true horror of the Hollywood machine is not how it controls you while you are inside it. The true horror is how it discards you the moment you are no longer of use. The lights were about to go out on the only world Lamont Bentley had known for his entire adult life. And the darkness that awaited him on the other side of that cancellation was deeper, colder, and far more ruthless than anything he could have ever anticipated. In the spring of 2001, the guillotine fell. There was no grand announcement, no respectful press conference, and certainly no tearful wrap party where executives handed out engraved watches to the cast that had built their network from the ground up. The television show Moesha, a cultural juggernaut that had anchored the network for 6 highly profitable seasons, simply ceased to exist. It was canceled abruptly, ending on an unresolved cliffhanger that left millions of fans bewildered and frustrated. But for the audience, it was merely an annoying television moment, a fleeting disappointment before they changed the channel. For the actors who lived and breathed inside that corporate machine, it was a sudden, violent eviction from the only reality they had known for the better part of a decade. When the lights are abruptly cut on a major studio lot, the silence that follows is not peaceful. It is deafening. It is the sound of a vacuum opening up and swallowing your entire identity. For years, the studio executives had meticulously cultivated the illusion of a family. They had sent the holiday cards, provided the lavish catering, and assured these young actors that they were part of a historic legacy. They used the language of kinship to extract maximum loyalty and maximum effort. But the moment the syndication numbers dipped below a mathematically acceptable threshold, the family dissolved into thin air. The security badges stopped working. The dressing rooms were summarily cleared out by production assistants to make way for the next crop of disposable youth. The producers and network presidents who used to hug Lamont Bentley, who used to call him a comedic genius at network upfronts, suddenly stopped returning his phone calls. This is the precise moment where the true terrifying architecture of the Hollywood discard machine reveals itself. To understand the depth of this betrayal, we must examine the stark, undeniable contrast in how the industry handles the transition of its stars. When a young white actor finishes a successful run on a teen drama or a family sitcom, an invisible, highly funded apparatus swings into motion. Major talent agencies deploy crisis managers, transition teams, and elite publicists. They book their clients on prestige magazine covers with headlines declaring their bold new chapter or their edgy maturation. They secure them supporting roles in critically acclaimed independent films, deliberately chosen to cleanse the palate of their sitcom past and signal to the Academy that a serious artist has arrived. The system acts as a golden parachute, carefully guiding them down to a new, mature, and highly lucrative plateau of their career. The system protects its investments because the system sees itself reflected in those young, white faces. For the young black sitcom star in the early 2000s, there was no parachute. There was only the cliff. Lamont Bentley stepped out of the sound stage and into an industry that had absolutely no infrastructure designed to support his transition into adult dramatic leading roles. He was not handed prestige scripts. He was not shielded by super agents who would wage war in boardrooms on his behalf. He was immediately thrust into the cold, unforgiving wilderness of the audition circuit, carrying the immense, crushing baggage of a character he had played entirely too well. He was 28 years old, at the absolute physical and artistic prime of his life, and the industry had already slapped the lethal, suffocating label of has-been across his forehead. Imagine the specific, agonizing psychological torture of that existence. You walk into an audition room for a serious, gritty police drama or a complex, emotionally tortured romantic lead. You have spent weeks preparing the material, digging into your own emotional reservoirs, studying the great method actors, ready to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you possess the heavy gravitas of a leading man. You are ready to bleed on that floor. But the moment you walk through the door, the casting directors do not see the man standing in front of them. They look at your face and their minds automatically trigger a canned laugh track. They see Hakeem Campbell. They expect you to do the dance. They expect the widened eyes, the exaggerated physical comedy, and the goofy, non-threatening grin. And when you deliver a nuanced, quiet, powerful read, they look confused, almost offended that you dared to step outside the box they built for you. They thank you for your time, politely usher you out, and hire someone whose face does not carry the ghost of a UPN sitcom. Your greatest professional triumph has mutated into an impenetrable prison. This creates a devastating paradox that few outside of Los Angeles can truly comprehend: the agonizing limbo of the recognizable unemployed actor. Lamont was too famous to live a normal life, but too typecast to secure the top-tier work required to sustain that fame. He could not walk into a grocery store, a gas station, or a restaurant without being mobbed by fans asking him to repeat his famous catchphrases. The public still adored him. They looked at him and assumed he was a millionaire, living in a sprawling mansion in the Hollywood Hills, enjoying the endless spoils of his global success. They did not know about the suppressed wages of black sitcom actors during the network boom. They did not know that the residual checks from a canceled show on a smaller, defunct network are often a mere fraction of what one might expect from a mainstream syndication powerhouse. They only saw the brilliant smile. They did not see the mounting financial panic of a man who suddenly, terrifyingly, had no steady source of income. And this is where the stakes escalate from mere professional frustration to profound existential dread. Lamont Bentley was not fighting for his ego. He was not chasing fame for the sake of vanity. He was fighting for his blood. He was fighting for his daughters. Alethea and Artesia were his anchors, the fundamental reasons he willed himself out of bed every morning when the industry was telling him to disappear. When you are a father, failure is not a philosophical concept you can discuss over coffee. It is a physical, terrifying threat to the people you love most in the world. The crushing weight of providing for them in Los Angeles, one of the most ruthlessly expensive cities on earth, began to bear down on him with the force of a collapsing building. The rent, the groceries, the health insurance. The terrifying realization that the safety net he thought he had woven over the last 6 years had never actually existed. He could not afford the luxury of retreating to a cabin in the woods to find his artistic truth. He had to hustle. He had to bleed. He had to survive by any means necessary. Desperation breeds a frantic, restless, and incredibly potent creative energy. Refusing to be utterly defeated by the television gatekeepers who had locked him out, Lamont pivoted. He sought out avenues where he could bypass the executives and speak directly to the audience on his own terms. He turned to music. He poured his dwindling resources, his late-night hours, and his creative desperation into forming an independent rap group called U-Prize. Music, particularly hip-hop, represented a sanctuary. It was a realm where a young black man could theoretically control his own narrative, strip away the sitcom gloss, and demand respect. In the recording booth, there were no network executives telling him to smile wider or tone down his edge. He could write his own lyrics. He could express the frustration, the anger, the systemic betrayal, and the authentic reality of his life that had been systematically scrubbed from his television persona. He poured his soul into the tracks, grinding in the studio late into the night, trying to build a new empire from the ashes of his television career, entirely without the backing of a major label machine. But the music industry is notoriously brutal, an impenetrable fortress even to established musical prodigies, let alone television actors attempting a crossover while burdened with a comedic stigma. Simultaneously, he returned to the most visceral, unforgiving, and terrifying arena of entertainment in existence, the stand-up comedy circuit. To the uninitiated viewer, Stand-up might seem like a natural, easy fit for a former sitcom star, but the reality of the circuit is far more grueling than any television set. A television soundstage is a heavily controlled, sanitized environment. You have teams of writers polishing your jokes, directors guiding your pacing, editors cutting your mistakes, and an audience that is literally instructed by a glowing sign when to applaud. A late-night comedy club in Los Angeles is a gladiatorial arena. It is dark, it is smoky, and the audience is often drunk, distracted, deeply cynical, and incredibly demanding. Standing on that stage, armed with nothing but a microphone and your own wits, stripped of the character of Hakeem, is an act of extreme psychological vulnerability. For Lamont, it was a punishing, relentless routine. He would drive his car across the sprawling, unforgiving expanse of Los Angeles, moving from one small, dimly lit club to another, hustling for 15 minutes of stage time. He was no longer the pampered star of a network flagship show. He was a working-class entertainer, battling in the trenches for a few $100s to keep the lights on at home and put food on the table for his girls. Imagine the severe psychological whiplash of that daily reality. A few short years prior, he was walking red carpets flanked by security guards, signing autographs for thousands of screaming teenagers who treated him like royalty. Now, he was standing in the cramped, graffiti-covered back room of a dingy club, waiting for his name to be called by an indifferent MC, hoping the crowd wouldn't just heckle him about being the guy from Moesha. He swallowed his pride daily. He took whatever minor acting gigs he could secure, refusing to let his ego override his responsibilities as a father. He made a brief, fleeting appearance in the comedy film The Wash. He took a guest spot on the sitcom The Parkers. He accepted roles that were vastly beneath his true explosive capabilities, simply because a working actor must work and a father must provide. Every small role was a lifeline, but it was also a painful reminder of how far he had fallen from the summit and how tightly the industry was determined to keep him in the margins. This specific period of his life, from 2001 to the end of 2004, is the dark matter of his biography. It is the time that the glossy entertainment news programs and the nostalgic retrospectives conveniently ignore, because there is absolutely no glamour in watching a brilliant man slowly being ground into dust by the machinery of his own responsibilities. He was running on pure adrenaline and sheer desperate willpower. The human body and the human mind are incredibly resilient instruments, capable of enduring immense trauma, but they are not invincible. When you subject a person to years of intense, unrelenting psychological dissonance, forcing them to behave like a clown when their soul demands to be a king, and then plunge them into an agonizing, sleep-deprived daily struggle for financial survival, you create a profound internal frailty. You hollow out the foundation. Lamont Bentley was a man fighting a brutal war on multiple fronts, entirely alone. He was fighting the industry's racist typecasting. He was fighting the looming, terrifying shadow of financial ruin. And he was fighting the exhausting, relentless demands of his own suffocated ambition. And yet, he refused to surrender. He refused to let the executives in Burbank have the final word on his legacy. He kept driving to auditions. He kept pitching his music. He kept stepping up to the microphone in those dark rooms, trying to wring laughter out of strangers to pay for his daughter's future. But the toll of that relentless, unforgiving hustle is entirely invisible to the naked eye. It does not show up on a resume. It does not make the evening news. It accumulates silently in the bones. It settles in the nervous system. It manifests in the heavy burning eyelids during a late-night drive home after a grueling set. Hollywood did not break Lamont Bentley's spirit. His spirit remained defiantly, beautifully, stubbornly intact until the very end. But the system was systematically, day by day, draining his physical reserves. They were not plotting his death, but they were undeniably setting the stage for a tragic collision between a man who simply refused to stop moving and a world that offered him absolutely no place to rest. The human body is an incredibly sophisticated engine, capable of absorbing massive amounts of stress, trauma, and fatigue. But it is governed by immutable laws of biology and physics. You cannot run a high-performance engine on fumes indefinitely. You cannot subject a nervous system to the relentless, oscillating extremes of massive public adulation, followed by sudden, terrifying financial instability, without leaving microscopic fractures in the foundation. By the time the calendar turned to January 2005, Artemis Lamont Bentley was a man operating with profound structural fractures. He was 31 years old. To the outside world, a man in his early 30s is at the dawn of his true adult power. But in the accelerated, unnatural timeline of a discarded child star, 31 can feel like the twilight of a grueling, century-long war. He had spent the last 4 years pushing a boulder up a mountain that the industry had specifically designed to be frictionless. He was hustling. In the lexicon of the entertainment industry, hustle is a highly romanticized concept. It is sold as a badge of honor, a necessary crucible that separates the dedicated artists from the amateurs. But this is a corporate lie designed to mask exploitation. When an actor who has already proven his massive commercial viability and raw artistic talent is forced to hustle for basic survival, it is not romantic. It is an indictment of a system that refuses to pay its debts. Lamont's hustle was a desperate, exhausting daily routine of driving across the sprawling expanse of Los Angeles, shaking hands with casting directors who still saw him as a sitcom sidekick, standing in smoky comedy clubs, late into the night and trying to forge a music career out of sheer willpower. We must understand the physical reality of this existence. When a privileged A-list Hollywood star shoots a film, their physical energy is fiercely protected. They have drivers, they have assistants, they sleep in luxury trailers. They are shielded from the mundane, exhausting friction of daily logistics because the studio views their energy as a multi-million-dollar asset. But when you are a discarded star trying to claw your way back from the margins, you are your own driver, your own assistant, and your own manager. You absorb all the friction yourself. You sit in the suffocating gridlock of the 405 freeway. You drink bad coffee to stay awake for a midnight recording session. You sacrifice sleep because sleep feels like a luxury you cannot afford when your daughter's futures are hanging in the balance. This accumulation of fatigue does not announce itself with a sudden collapse. It is insidious. It is the slight blurring of peripheral vision. It is the heaviness behind the eyes. It is the microseconds of delayed reaction time that you learn to ignore because you have a meeting, an audition, or a screening to attend. And Lamont Bentley, true to his profound resilience, was still attending those screenings. He had absolutely refused to surrender to the apathy of the industry. On the evening of January the 18th, 2005, he dressed up and went out into the Hollywood night. He was not going to a massive studio-funded blockbuster premiere with a red carpet and a phalanx of paparazzi. He was attending the screening of an independent short film titled Shards. This detail is not merely a footnote in a police report. It is a crucial, heartbreaking piece of evidence in understanding who this man truly was. Independent cinema is the absolute antithesis of the shiny, corporate, laugh-track-driven network television machine that had built and subsequently destroyed his early career. Independent films are where actors go to bleed. They are where budgets are small, the lighting is harsh, and the acting must be extraordinarily raw and authentic. The fact that Lamont was at this screening, supporting independent art, mingling with filmmakers outside the traditional studio system, speaks volumes about his artistic hunger. He was actively, deliberately seeking the exact kind of gritty, complex narrative that the network executives had spent years denying him. He was in the room, he was smiling, he was working the crowd, he was doing exactly what a professional actor is supposed to do to stay relevant and forge new alliances. He was looking for the open door, or perhaps looking for the tools to build a new door himself. Friends and colleagues who saw him that night reported that he was upbeat. He was his usual charismatic self. The mask was perfectly in place. But underneath the warm smile and the firm handshakes, the biological engine was running dangerously close to empty. The screening ended. The crowds dispersed into the cool, biting winter air of Southern California. The social performance was over, and now Lamont had to execute the most dangerous yet utterly mundane task of the working-class actor. He had to drive himself home. Shortly after midnight, transitioning into the very early dark hours of January the 19th, he got into his vehicle. The contrast between the vibrant, hopeful energy of an indie film screening and the immediate solitary confinement of a car interior at midnight is jarring. The adrenaline of the social interaction begins to evaporate, leaving behind a heavy, settling exhaustion. He merged onto the 118 freeway, heading toward Simi Valley. The geography of the Los Angeles freeway system at night is a strange, hypnotic environment. During the day, it is a parking lot of frustration. But after midnight, it opens up into a vast, dark, concrete ribbon. The amber streetlights pass rhythmically. The hum of the engine becomes a drone. For a perfectly rested driver, it is a straightforward commute. But for a man carrying the psychological weight of a stalled career, the intense pressure of providing for 2 children, and the sheer accumulated sleep debt of a 4-year hustle, that dark freeway is a lethal environment. We do not know exactly what happened in the cabin of that vehicle in the seconds before the crash. The physics of the tragedy, however, are brutally documented. Traveling at a high rate of speed through the dark, the vehicle suddenly lost control. This is the moment where the narrative shifts from a psychological drama to a terrifying kinetic reality. The car veered violently off the designated path. It tore through a chain-link fence, the metal screaming against the frame of the car. It plummeted down a steep embankment. The momentum was uncontrollable, tossing the vehicle into a series of violent, terrifying rolls. In modern television and film, we are desensitized to car crashes. They are heavily choreographed spectacles filled with stuntmen and CGI, where the hero invariably crawls out of the shattered windshield with a minor cut on their forehead. But the physical reality of a high-speed rollover in the dead of night is an event of unimaginable chaotic violence. The sheer centrifugal force generated by a rolling vehicle is designed to tear things apart. During the violent tumbling of the car, Lamont Bentley was ejected from the vehicle. He was thrown out into the cold, unforgiving darkness, landing on the hard tarmac of the active freeway. And here, the tragedy compounds itself into an almost unbearable nightmare. He survived the initial ejection, but he was lying in the middle of a dark motorway, invisible to the oncoming traffic. In a matter of agonizing moments, he was struck by multiple vehicles whose drivers simply could not see him in time to stop. The man who had brought so much warmth, so much laughter, and so much light to millions of living rooms around the world met his end in the most violent, cold, and profoundly lonely manner conceivable. The physical destruction of his body was absolute. When the sun rose over Los Angeles a few hours later, the machinery of the Hollywood media complex woke up and immediately went to work. It is crucial to observe how this machine operates when a tragedy involves a young black actor. There is a deeply ingrained, almost reflexive script that the tabloid media follows. Before the wreckage was even fully cleared from the 118 freeway, the whispers began. The headlines were drafted with a specific, insidious subtext. They painted a picture of a troubled former star. They speculated wildly about the cause of the crash. The underlying unspoken assumption in the press rooms was toxic and predictable. If a young black man from a canceled sitcom dies in a high-speed crash after midnight, it must be his own fault. It must be drugs. It must be alcohol. It must be the tragic, familiar narrative of a celebrity who lost his mind to the excesses of Hollywood. The media prefers this narrative because it absolves the industry of any responsibility. If Lamont Bentley was just a reckless addict, then the system that underpaid him, typecast him, and threw him away does not have to look in the mirror. They can simply shake their heads, broadcast a 30-second memorial montage of his funniest sitcom moments, and move on to the next disposable star. But history is a patient, meticulous detective, and the facts do not care about tabloid narratives. When the official coroner's report and the toxicology results were finally released, they fell like a sledgehammer on the cynical assumptions of the press. The toxicology screen was completely, undeniably clean. There were no illicit narcotics in his bloodstream. There was no alcohol. There was no reckless cocktail of Hollywood excess. This revelation is the true climax of the tragedy. It is the moment the narrative flips from a predictable cautionary tale into a devastating indictment of systemic abuse. Because if there were no drugs and if there was no alcohol, what killed Lamont Bentley? What truly caused the crash? While police reports note the vehicle was traveling at a high rate of speed, many industry observers and those close to him point to a more insidious factor: sheer, crushing exhaustion. He was a father driving home late at night after trying to secure a future for his children. Some theories suggest he may have fallen victim to a microsleep or a momentary lapse in concentration, a fatal consequence of a biological engine running dangerously close to empty. This is not a glamorous Hollywood death. It is a profoundly working-class tragedy. It is the kind of death that happens to long-haul truckers, to double-shift nurses, and to gig workers trying to make ends meet. The fact that it happened to a man whose face was famous across the globe exposes the grand illusion of the entertainment industry. Fame did not protect him. Fame was merely the weight that pulled him under. No studio executive physically cut the brake lines on his car. They did not force him off the road. However, they meticulously constructed the economic and psychological maze that left him navigating that dark highway. They starved him of the creative and financial oxygen he had earned, leaving a brilliantly talented actor profoundly depleted in a desperate search for survival. When you look at the shattered concrete and the flashing red lights of the police cruisers illuminating the wreckage on the 118 freeway, you are not just looking at a traffic accident. You are looking at the final, inevitable, kinetic result of a massive multi-billion-dollar corporate apparatus that extracts the joy, the youth, and the vitality of a human being, and then leaves them to navigate the darkness completely alone. The crash was merely the physical manifestation of a man who had been pushed past the breaking point of human endurance. And as the ambulances pulled away and the highway patrol slowly reopened the lanes of the freeway, the silence returned. But it was no longer the silence of a canceled soundstage. It was the permanent, echoing silence of a brilliant voice that had been violently, prematurely extinguished, leaving behind a legacy that the world was entirely unprepared to understand. The morning after the crash, a macabre surrealism unfolded. Lamont Bentley lay in a coroner's office, yet he was simultaneously alive and laughing on thousands of television screens in syndicated reruns. The Hollywood machine simply issued standard condolences and moved on, but for the community who truly knew him, the grief was seismic. They knew he was not a cautionary tale of celebrity excess. He was a brilliant, devoted father, crushed by a system that demanded his joy but denied his complexity. As the years pass and the tapes continue to loop, that canned laughter carries the weight of a profound, unresolved grief. Lamont Bentley did not fail. He was failed. And his story remains a haunting reminder of the human cost hidden behind the velvet curtains of Hollywood.